Gauntlet was brought to us in arcades by Atari Games back in 1985. I remember this one as a kid in holiday camps, but it always seemed to have older players around it, with a haze of smoke generally. Arguably one of Atari Games' most memorable games through its chaotic battles of the undead, a game that had a hell of a lot happening simultaneously on the screen, which was very unusual. Yes, one might consider this a game for the geeks, as to some extent it had that Dungeons and Dragons setting, which was very popular at the time of this release, and the world had just seen a satanic panic too. If you were into hair metal, glam metal, or rock in general in the mid-80s, you most definitely likely were a Satanist of the highest order possible, and if you happen to be a fan of Gauntlet 2, you were most definitely going to the depths of hell for this, without a doubt. Gauntlet was a mean game that required you to battle through darkest dungeons, taking on evil, collecting keys, unlocking doors, destroying portals, and finally exit the higher stages. For its time, the use of voice synthesizers in a game would have been very unusual and likely draw people in too through its innovation within the arcade. To know, Amiga's 2012 homebrew version will not be included, as this is considered an aftermarket release, and also the Nintendo Entertainment System version will also not be included, as this version was a mix-up of Gauntlet 1 and 2 and did not follow the same structure as the original arcades game. If I'm missing out a version here, I sincerely apologise, so let's go battle Satan himself. Owners of the Apple II computer would have been treated in 1988 with the Mindscape conversion of Gauntlet, but was it actually a good port? Well, we would just say it functions to some extent. Of course, as in gameplay footage you can see very poor frame drops within the gameplay from scratch pretty much. Of course, when you are overwhelmed with creatures of the night who are aiming to destroy you, this brings down the frame rate even further, in which using a controller to fire seems paused and takes a moment to remember the button you've actually requested. It looks acceptable for an Apple II game, but not particularly a fun game to play by any means. It's far too slow for its own good, with some very primitive sounds incorporated. This 16-bit Apple IIgs conversion is a massive upgrade from the original Apple II's conversion of Gauntlet in more ways than one. Firstly, the GS looks much nicer, almost like Mindscape in 1988 actually had some care with this version. It runs smoother and it does look the part, although admittedly it is very pixelated. Of course, the difference between 8 and 16-bit games will always be a big factor to consider, but really that shouldn't be the case. The original 1986 Apple II game really was just terrible. I actually used my keyboard to control this version, and it was fairly responsive as far as keyboards get with a game of this age. Magic, when used, worked well when requested, and also had some light sound effects too, which weren't too groundbreaking to be honest. The wizard who was playing as in this version sounded more like he was striking a match rather than throwing balls of fire. One thing that is a bit strange with this port is its blue border. Every other microcomputer conversion used black. That kind of adds a little more darkness to the gameplay areas. Light blue just doesn't signify terror. Now, regretfully, the Atari 800 or Atari 8-bit conversion isn't too wonderful. Sound effects are on par with most other 8-bit Atari games. As you will see in the gameplay footage, I could not map this out correctly, and so was controlling two characters at the same time as a two-player game. You will see some noise being generated. This was likely down to either bad programming or the fact that I had joystick ports the wrong way around. Anyways, the game itself is fairly average, nothing spectacular. It does look nicer than, say, the Apple II conversion, and scrolling wasn't too bad either for this conversion. Really though, you can do a lot better than the Atari 8-bit port. The IBM PC compatible conversion almost seems very similar to the C64's version, in that very similar colours was used, yet looked nicer as almost like a spiritual upgrade in this department. Sprites are a little more detailed in this DOS version too. The game does seem like it is struggling to keep up with the action, and of course this does slow it down when more enemies are on the screen at once. I think a cut down of enemies likely would have made this Mindscape release a little more fluid to play. Sound effects are very typical for this era, which is the old-fashioned beeper sound effects. Okay, so as some of you are likely aware, my first system growing up was a C64. I knew a Gauntlet from holiday camp arcades, but in general, these had crowds around them, which I was always blocked out of to see what the game was really actually like. Now, for the game, firstly, like other ports, to have so much happening on screen at once would have been a difficult task for any coder for programming one of these micro 8-bit computers. Surprisingly, although it was not chaotic in terms of enemies as the arcade original, the C64 actually puts up a good fight of making this happen to some extent. Yes, the game is pretty dull in terms of colour, and the only voice synthesizer is that of the character you play as when he or her gets hurt. The original arcade machine game would also have information pop up to guide the player and just generally give the player information over what does what in the game. The game fully playable of course, but doesn't really give you the overall arcade experience. It doesn't lag as one might expect it to, and it actually does a fairly good job considering this is a fairly blocky looking port too. A likely unpopular opinion for Commodore 64 fans, but I really do think that the MSX conversion just played that little better, dare I say it. Yes, we have a black floor, but is that really a bad thing? After all, we are navigating through dungeons here, and why should they really be all lit up like in most versions? I think that could be a good way of explaining this. Now, in terms of gameplay, it certainly plays well with fairly faster version 2 compared with the C64 port, although sprites are largely made up of one colour in this version. They kind of look nicer than the C64's, and they aren't particularly pixelated either. Regardless of having many baddies on screen at the same time, the MSX port seems to handle all this really well. Considering the fairly dull look with the Commodore 64 conversion, I actually thought the ZX Spectrum port looked and played a little faster with the specky, and seemed the case for the very similar looking MSX conversion too. I played this on my OLED screen and good lord did these Spectrum colours look good. I highly recommend OLED screens for Spectrum games. Firstly, there is much more activity with enemies with the Spectrum version, and as we know, the game is more awesome with larger swarms of baddies. It gives the player that sense of panic should you be running on low health, for example. Although there is no voice synth at all in the Spectrum's version, or no instructions as you play through it, I think the smoothness and very basic and almost berserk look about it makes up for those sacrifices. Unlike the C64's conversion, the Spectrum's version also doesn't look as pixelated and blocky. One lucky thing that developers didn't need to add for home computer versions of Gauntlet is music in game, just sound effects. And so this Amstrad CPC version could use that to its advantage by adding more to the game itself. I think that out of all of the three major 8-bit micros here in Britain, those being Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, and of course this platform, the Amstrad, the CPC is superb conversion. Although it felt like monsters on screen at the same time, wasn't as hectic as the Spectrum's port, this significantly reduces the risk of frame rate slowdowns and flickers. The port for Amstrad is nice and colourful, sounds really well too, and plays truly nicely. A truly faithful 8-bit computer port of the original 1985 arcade game. The Sega Master's Gauntlet conversion is a fairly respectful port. It looks and plays the part, and it plays really well too, with some really nice colours, especially on the tiles themselves, or as some people like to call them, as sprites. Dungeons are nicely put together with added extras of making the floor look like a real floor rather than just painting a single colour like some other ports have done. The only issue with this 8-bit console version is the pace of it. After playing several different versions of this game at this point, I did notice there was an increased speed, which I guess is fine sometimes. You just need to get to exits and save some time. Other than that, like I say, a great port with some nicely implemented controls with nice collision detection too. The Atari ST port looks great, and it also plays very well too. The sound effects are pretty ample for imitating the source material. It scrolls very smoothly, and no issues from this version with massive frame drops like some other versions have had. The sprites are really nicely drawn, with a very nice use of colours for the dungeons and so on, but the next port in the video can push it that little much further. And in first place, I've actually ranked Gauntlet IV for the Sega Mega Drive. Gauntlet IV was its own game, but it also came packed with the original arcades game. Of course, enhancing it with some really fitting background music, as well as some impressive voice and sound effects too. The game depth looks much better than many other versions in this video. It kind of gives the player the illusion that we are fairly high up looking down into the dungeons. The clever shadow work on each sprite and even objects make this happen really nicely. The hordes of monsters can get overwhelming in this version, but that doesn't stop the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis from doing a great job with this very awesome conversion. It is very smooth to control with excellent collision detection, and the color palette use is really nicely done too with this port. And that's it for today's ranking of various different ports for Gauntlet. So let me know if you agree with my top place. Which version did you play growing up in? Which was the version you most hated? Anyways, until next video, thanks for watching.
Ooh.